On March 6, 1943, George S. Patton arrived at the headquarters of the battered U.S. Second Corps in Tunisia and discovered that the man he had come to replace was still having breakfast. That detail sounded almost absurd beside the wreckage of Kasserine Pass. American soldiers had been driven from positions, confused orders had scattered formations, and the German army had exposed every weakness in the young American command. But Patton did not see a force that had merely lost a battle. He saw an army that had lost its rhythm. There were no clean lines between authority and confusion. Headquarters were too far behind the fighting. Officers disagreed over orders. Units were committed in fragments. Soldiers had learned that retreat could begin before anyone clearly told them why. Across the desert, German commanders had recognized the hesitation and turned it into momentum. Patton had 10 days. In 10 days, he would have to impose discipline on nearly 90,000 men, restore confidence in officers who had lost the trust of their own troops, and prepare the Corps for an attack that higher commanders expected to be limited, cautious, and carefully controlled. But Patton had no intention of merely surviving another battle. He was about to make decisions that would anger generals, humiliate officers, and convince many soldiers that their new commander had lost his mind. And before those 10 days were over, the same army that had been dismissed as unready would face German armor at El Guetar and refuse to break. The transformation began not with a brilliant maneuver, but with a breakfast, a uniform, and a question Patton asked every officer who crossed his path: who is actually in command here? The answer had already been written in the dust of Kasserine Pass. The American defeat in Tunisia was not a single collapse. It was a chain reaction. One unit was sent forward without enough support. Another was ordered to withdraw while a neighboring formation remained exposed. Headquarters issued instructions that traveled slowly, sometimes arriving after the battlefield had already changed. Tanks, infantry, artillery, and aircraft often fought as separate instruments instead of one force. The German commanders did not need to destroy the entire American army. They only needed to find the gaps between its decisions. At Kasserine, those gaps became roads. The disaster shocked Allied leadership because the American army was not supposed to be helpless. It had numbers, equipment, artillery, air power, and fresh divisions. Yet numbers meant very little when officers could not convert them into coordinated action. The soldiers were not cowards. That was one of the first things George Patton understood. The men had fought. They had held ground under fire. They had climbed ridges, dug positions, carried ammunition, and tried to make sense of orders that often made no sense at all. What had failed was the machinery above them. Patton had seen enough of war to recognize the difference between a frightened soldier and a frightened command structure. A frightened soldier might crouch in a trench. A frightened command structure hid behind distance, paperwork, and explanations. Patton despised explanations. He had been preparing for Operation Husky, the coming Allied invasion of Sicily, when a motorcycle messenger found him on March 4 near Casablanca. The order was immediate. He was to go to Tunisia and take command of Second Corps. Patton recorded the assignment in language that revealed both his anger and his confidence. He was taking over a mess, but he would make a go of it. That sentence carried a dangerous assumption. Patton believed the problem was not that American troops could not fight. The problem was that too many officers had allowed confusion to become normal. If he was right, the Corps could be repaired. If he was wrong, he would merely drive exhausted soldiers into another defeat. When Patton reached headquarters on March 6th, the change of command was not theatrical. There was no grand battlefield ceremony and no dramatic line of officers waiting in formation. There was a command center, a disappointed staff, and Lloyd Fredendall, the officer whose leadership had come under growing criticism after Kasserine. Fredendall had not created every weakness in Second Corps. The Corps had been assembled from inexperienced formations. Its command arrangements had shifted repeatedly. It had entered combat in a difficult theater against an enemy with years of battlefield experience. But after Kasserine, confidence in Fredendall had drained away. Eisenhower had sent Omar Bradley to inspect the Corps. Bradley spoke with division commanders and found that they had lost confidence in Fredendall as Corps commander. Harold Alexander's headquarters had reached similar concerns after reviewing the condition of the force. The decision was no longer simply about blame. It was about whether the next battle would be fought under the same habits that had produced the last one. Eisenhower relieved Fredendall and selected Patton. Bradley was assigned to Patton's headquarters as a check on the new commander, but Patton quickly turned the arrangement to his advantage by making Bradley his deputy. That decision mattered. Bradley was experienced, observant, and deliberate. Patton was aggressive, theatrical, and impatient. Their temperaments were different, but that difference made the partnership useful. Patton could create motion. Bradley could tell him when the motion was becoming dangerous. Patton did not arrive to build a comfortable command relationship. He arrived to break the existing one. On his first morning, he ordered the mess closed at 7:30. To exhausted soldiers, the order seemed ridiculous. Men were already living under shortages, heat, dust, exhaustion, and the constant possibility of artillery fire. Why should the mess close while officers were still trying to eat? Because Patton was not merely regulating breakfast. He was measuring whether orders still mattered. An army in crisis often reveals itself through small disobediences. The missed salute, the unbuttoned uniform, the helmet left behind, the officer who arrives late because he assumes the schedule is flexible, the staff section that delays an instruction because nobody wants to own the decision. Patton attacked those habits one by one. He ordered soldiers and officers to wear proper uniforms. He demanded neckties. He insisted that helmets be strapped on. He fined men for violations. To the troops, these commands looked like petty tyranny. A man could fight all night and still be punished because his uniform was not arranged correctly. But Patton believed appearance was not separate from combat power. Every act of discipline was a message. Tie the necktie, strap the helmet, salute the officer, report at the appointed hour, move when ordered. The soldier was being reminded that the army had rules, and rules meant somebody was responsible. Bradley later recognized the psychological purpose. Each small correction reminded the men that the days before Kasserine were over. That was the point. Patton did not expect a necktie to stop a German tank. He expected a command culture that tolerated small disorder to collapse when confronted with large danger. The crackdown produced resentment immediately. Soldiers became furious. Some considered it absurd that a man could be fined for appearing without a tie, while the army was preparing to attack across open desert. But Patton was willing to be hated if hatred produced attention. The question was whether the officers would accept the same standard. Patton began inspecting headquarters and frontline positions. He searched for the distance between the map and the battlefield. Were commanders close enough to see what their soldiers were facing? Did they understand the ground? Were orders clear? Did staffs know where their units were? Did officers make decisions or merely forward messages? He found a command system that had been physically and psychologically separated from its troops. The Corps headquarters was too distant. Subordinate commanders often acted without a common picture of the battlefield. Orders moved in fragments. A division might receive one instruction while another formation received a different instruction based on an outdated situation. Patton wanted the Corps to become visible to itself. He demanded reports. He moved among headquarters. He asked questions that officers could not answer with polished language. Where is your regiment? What is holding up the road? What is the enemy trying to do? What will you do if he succeeds? A commander who could not answer was no longer merely uninformed. He had become part of the danger. The most difficult transformation was not physical, it was emotional. Kasserine had taught American officers to expect failure. They did not necessarily believe the Germans were invincible, but they had begun to believe that any aggressive move might expose them to disaster. Their instinct was to wait for more information, more ammunition, more support, more permission. Patton understood that waiting could be rational in one moment and fatal in the next. He wanted officers to act before certainty arrived. That did not mean acting blindly. It meant accepting responsibility. An army cannot attack when every decision must climb through layers of hesitation. The enemy does not wait for the perfect plan. The enemy creates an imperfect situation and forces a response. Patton's answer was speed. He ordered more training. He pushed units to rehearse movement, communications, coordination, and artillery support. He wanted officers to understand what would happen when the plan began to fail, because every plan eventually failed once the first shells landed. He demanded that formations know their missions before crossing the line of departure. He wanted artillery ready to respond. He expected armor and infantry to support one another instead of arriving as separate promises. The date for the offensive had already been selected, March 17th. Patton took command on March 6th. 10 days. The number became a pressure inside the headquarters. The Corps was expected to attack before Patton had even learned the personalities of its commanders. Alexander and Eisenhower needed the force to recover its confidence, but they did not want to gamble the entire Corps in a reckless advance. II Corps was given a limited mission. It would clear Gafsa, then move toward El Guitar, Sened Station, and Magnasi. It would protect the flank of Montgomery's British Eighth Army and draw German forces away from the Eastern Front. Patton hated the limitations. He believed the Corps needed more than a symbolic advance. It needed proof that it could take the initiative and hold it. A timid operation might recover a few miles of desert while leaving the deeper wound untouched. But higher command had learned from Kasserine too. The Corps would not be trusted with a dramatic independent drive. It would be controlled. British liaison officers would be added. American units would receive reinforcements. The underpowered American 37mm anti-tank gun would be replaced by the British 6-pounder. 75 officers and 175 enlisted men would be added from other American formations. The Army was not leaving Second Corps alone with its weaknesses. Patton understood the insult hidden inside the assistance. British officers were being sent to guide the Americans. New anti-tank weapons were arriving because the existing ones had proved inadequate. Additional personnel were being used to repair gaps in formations that were supposed to be ready. But he did not waste time defending American pride. He used every reinforcement. The new commander knew confidence could not be restored through speeches alone. Soldiers trusted results. Officers trusted results. Eisenhower trusted results. Alexander trusted results. The Army needed one victory that could not be explained away. Before that victory could come, Patton had to decide what to do with the officers who had presided over failure. This is where the popular story becomes more dramatic than the evidence. Patton did not simply dismiss every commander who had served under Fredendall. He did not purge the Corps in a frenzy. His most consequential personnel decision came after observing the performance of Orlando Ward, commander of the 1st Armored Division. Ward was not an incompetent officer. His division had performed better than 2nd Corps headquarters during the Kasserine fighting. Alexander's inspection report had been more favorable toward the 1st Armored Division and the morale of its troops than toward Fredendall's command structure. But Patton judged commanders by what they did under pressure, not merely by what they had survived. When the offensive began, Ward's armored forces advanced through difficult terrain and encountered defenses around Hill 322 near McNassey. The position dominated the road east. The attack faced resistance from artillery, mortars, and German defensive positions. Ward did not throw his exhausted troops forward without preparation. He paused to organize a deliberate attack. From a conventional point of view, the decision had logic. His orders restricted how far he could advance. Enemy aircraft were nearby. The ground was difficult. A daylight attack against prepared heights could cost lives without guaranteeing success. Patton saw something else. He saw an opportunity slipping away. Patton wanted to demonstrate that 2nd Corps could keep pressure on the enemy. He believed a strong move east would persuade Alexander to authorize a larger advance toward the coast, but Hill 322 had to be cleared first. As long as Ward remained stalled, the Corps could not prove that it had recovered its initiative. Patton's frustration grew with every delay. On March 24th, when he learned that the attack had stalled again, he ordered Ward to lead the next attack personally and ensure that it did not fail. The order was more than tactical. It was a direct challenge to the division commander. Patton was telling Ward that the time for remote supervision had ended. If the attack mattered, the commander had to place himself where the decision became physical. Ward did so the following morning. The attack gained ground at first. Then mortar, artillery, and machine gun fire drove the attacking troops from the heights. Ward called off the attack at noon. Patton did not accept the decision. To Ward, the attack had reached the point where further pressure would waste men. To Patton, the withdrawal confirmed that the division lacked the aggression he believed the situation required. The battle around Hill 322 exposed a conflict that would shape the American army for the rest of the war. How much initiative was enough? When did caution become wisdom? And when did it become fear wearing a uniform? Patton believed a commander had to impose his will on events. Ward believed events had to be respected, because the enemy's firepower was real and soldiers could not be replaced by confidence. Both men understood war. They simply measured risk differently. Patton relieved Ward from command of the 1st Armored Division. The decision shocked officers who knew that Ward had not been the architect of the Kasserine disaster. He had commanded a division that had fought hard. Yet Patton was not punishing Ward for causing the earlier defeat. He was deciding that a different commander was needed for the next phase. That distinction was cold, and it was deliberate. Patton wanted officers to understand that past reputation would not protect them, nor would reasonable explanations. A commander could be brave, experienced, and respected, and still be removed if Patton believed he would not attack with the necessary speed. The relief carried a second message. Patton was not asking soldiers to be aggressive while officers remained insulated from the consequences of delay. The Army's new discipline went upward as well as downward. But the personnel changes did not solve the battlefield problem by themselves. Patton still had to make Second Corps function. The first opportunity came when the Axis forces withdrew from Gafsa. On March 17th, Ward's 1st Armored Division moved forward and discovered that the enemy had already abandoned the town. The advance did not produce the dramatic clash Patton wanted. There was no armored showdown, no sudden victory over a German formation, no battlefield moment that could erase Kasserine in a single stroke. Instead, the Corps moved into ground the enemy had vacated. Patton pressed the armored forces to retain the initiative, but heavy seasonal rain turned the desert into mud. Vehicles were restricted to improved roads. Every movement became slower. The weather placed limits on aggression that no speech could overcome. That was the first test of the new command. Could Patton maintain pressure when the terrain refused to cooperate? He did not confuse movement with progress. The Corps had to continue preparing for contact, while the weather delayed the armor. On March 18th, William Darby's 1st Ranger Battalion captured El Guitar, mostly without resistance. The Rangers moved with the confidence Patton wanted to see. Their success did not mean the entire Corps had been transformed, but it gave the army a foothold. The next objective was Sened. It took 4 days for the armored vanguard to reach the area. On March 21, Combat Commands A and C of the 1st Armored Division, supported by the 60th Regimental Combat Team, converged on Sened from the north and west. This time, artillery helped dislodge the enemy. Many Axis troops were captured as they withdrew. The action was not spectacular. That was exactly why it mattered. The Corps had moved deliberately, coordinated its formations, used artillery, and forced the enemy to retreat. It had not allowed confusion to turn into panic. Patton's soldiers were learning that German troops could be pushed. But the enemy had not yet tested the new American command with its strongest weapon. That test came at El Guitar. While American infantry captured high ground east of the town, German and Italian forces prepared to counterattack. The 10th Panzer Division, under strength but still dangerous, moved against the 1st Infantry Division. Before dawn on March 23rd, German armor advanced northwest along the road from Gabes toward Gafsa. The attackers approached through the valley in multiple columns, supported by motorized infantry and self-propelled guns. The American defenders spotted the movement. That detail mattered. At Kasserine, units had often discovered danger after the enemy had already entered the battle. At El Guitar, observation, mines, artillery, and anti-tank weapons were integrated into the defense. The Germans pushed forward and achieved initial success. Then they reached the Kadab Wadi near Hill 336. A dense minefield immobilized 8 German tanks. American artillery and tank destroyers engaged the trapped armor. Another 30 German tanks were destroyed. The battle now belonged to the side that could keep its system working under pressure. The Germans withdrew temporarily, towing damaged vehicles and preparing another attack. The Americans used the pause to replenish ammunition and call in air attacks. When the Germans resumed the assault that evening, American artillery stopped them. The German force had not been annihilated. The Americans had not delivered a perfect victory, but the attack had failed to break through. More important, the American soldiers had seen German armor stop. They had seen mines hold. They had seen artillery respond. They had seen tank destroyers hit the enemy. They had seen German troops pull back. The enemy was still dangerous. He was not invincible. That discovery could not be written into an order. It had to be experienced. Patton's 10-day transformation was therefore not the story of a commander shouting courage into frightened men. It was the story of an army learning that courage had to be connected to organization. A soldier who believes his artillery will answer is more willing to hold. An infantryman who knows tanks will support the flank is more willing to advance. A tank crew that knows the infantry understands the plan is less likely to charge into isolation. An officer who knows his superior will demand an answer is more likely to make a decision before the situation becomes impossible. This was Patton's real method. He used discipline, pressure, visibility, and personal energy to close the gaps between individuals and formations. His style was harsh because he believed softness had already become institutionalized. At headquarters, he spoke in language designed to shock. On the road, he drove toward the fighting. At command posts, he demanded maps, communications, and answers. He wanted subordinates to feel that he might appear at any moment. That fear could produce obedience, but obedience alone could not win the battle. Patton also radiated confidence. Officers saw a commander who seemed incapable of accepting defeat as a permanent condition. His certainty was sometimes theatrical, even excessive, yet soldiers understood what the performance communicated. Their commander believed the army could recover. The belief was contagious because it was attached to movement. Patton was not sitting behind a map promising that victory would come someday. He was driving toward the front, changing orders, confronting commanders, and demanding action. The Corps began to resemble its commander. That created new dangers. Patton's impatience could turn a limited mission into an uncontrolled attack. His desire to prove American strength could collide with Alexander's restrictions. His criticism of Ward risked damaging trust among division commanders. His discipline campaign could become empty ritual if it distracted from ammunition, artillery, communications, and ground. The army needed Patton's energy, but it also needed Bradley's judgment and Eisenhower's control. Bradley's presence became essential. Eisenhower had placed Bradley at Patton's headquarters partly to observe the situation. Patton responded by making him deputy commander, keeping him close rather than allowing him to operate as a distant inspector. The arrangement created a balance. Patton pushed. Bradley watched. Patton demanded action. Bradley assessed whether the action matched the ground. Patton saw opportunities everywhere. Bradley saw the cost of each one. The partnership never eliminated conflict, but it reduced the chance that Patton's personal style would outrun the Corps. Meanwhile, Alexander continued to limit Second Corps' mission. Patton wanted a drive toward the coast. Alexander wanted the Corps to clear the ground, protect Montgomery's flank, and draw Axis forces away from the Eastern Front. The difference was not merely ambition. It reflected the strategic reality of Tunisia. The Allied armies had to coordinate across a difficult theater. Montgomery's 8th Army was attacking from the east. The German and Italian forces could shift reserves. Every American move affected the larger campaign. A local commander could see an opening that higher headquarters considered too costly or too uncertain. Patton viewed restraint as a leftover from Kasserine. Alexander viewed restraint as a way to prevent another Kasserine. The tension intensified around McNassy. On March 19th, the mission changed. Second Corps was ordered to clear McNassy, seize the high ground to the east, and raid enemy airfields near Mizuna. From there, the Corps would shift to defense and draw Axis forces away from Montgomery. Then, on March 22nd, Montgomery proposed a more ambitious American attack against the Sfax-Gabays Road. Alexander rejected the larger plan, but instructed Patton to prepare a mobile column for a possible attack while continuing operations around McNassy and El Guitar. Patton now had multiple missions, changing boundaries, and limited time. This was exactly the kind of situation in which command systems collapse. The difference was that Patton's headquarters was now prepared to absorb the change. Orders were issued, formations were directed, the Corps moved. The attack toward Hill 322 became the center of the crisis. Ward's forces pushed against the position while the enemy strengthened its defenses. The first attempt stalled. The second nearly succeeded. Reinforcements arrived for the defenders just as they were preparing to withdraw. A small margin separated victory from failure. Patton interpreted the margin as a test of will. Ward interpreted it as evidence that the enemy position had been reinforced and would require a stronger attack. The next assault failed. Patton relieved Ward. The decision remains controversial because it does not fit neatly into the legend of Patton as an infallible commander. Ward had been correct about some dangers. The attack against Hill 322 was costly and difficult. Patton's larger ambitions were not fully realized. Two Corps did not break through to the coast in that operation. Yet relief from command was not always a verdict on a man's courage. Sometimes it was a decision about what kind of behavior a commander wanted to reward. Patton rewarded pressure. He believed that if officers were permitted to stop after near success, the old habits would return. The memory of Kasserine would become stronger than the promise of recovery. The danger was obvious. An army could be driven forward until it exhausted itself. Patton's genius, where it existed, was not simply aggression. It was the ability to connect aggression with structure. When that connection failed, his methods could become destructive. At El Guitar, the connection held. The German counterattack against the 1st Infantry Division showed how far the Corps had come in a matter of days. The Americans had not become veterans overnight. Many of the soldiers still lacked combat experience. Some officers were still learning. Equipment remained imperfect. Communications could fail. Weather could stop movement. The enemy could still exploit weaknesses. But the army was no longer responding as disconnected pieces. The 1st Infantry Division had occupied high ground and identified avenues of approach. Engineers had laid mines. Artillery had planned fires. Tank destroyers were positioned to engage armor. Infantry had a defensive structure that could absorb the attack. When the German armor came, the American formation did not dissolve. That was the achievement Patton had been pursuing since March 6th. Not a dramatic charge, not a perfect victory, a system that could remain intact under pressure. The fighting around El Guitar continued for days. The Americans and Axis forces exchanged attacks, probes, and artillery fire. Neither side possessed enough strength to simply overwhelm the other. The 9th Infantry Division was eventually withdrawn through the positions held by Darby's Rangers. The Corps had suffered losses and frustration. The advance had not fulfilled every ambition. Patton remained angry at delays and cautious decisions. But 2nd Corps had not suffered another Kasserine. When Montgomery's forces broke through the Mareth defenses and advanced toward Gabes, the Axis position in Tunisia became increasingly difficult to sustain. The German and Italian armies were being pressed from multiple directions. The wider campaign was changing. Patton's corps had played its assigned role. It had drawn enemy forces, protected the flank, captured ground, and fought off a major armored counterattack. The American army had proved that it could learn. That mattered beyond Tunisia. Before Kasserine, American commanders had been treated as inexperienced but promising. After Kasserine, some Allied officers questioned whether they were ready for large-scale combat. The British had experienced commanders and battle-hardened formations. The Germans had operational skill accumulated over years of war. The Americans had equipment and manpower, but those advantages would be wasted without command competence. Kasserine made the problem impossible to ignore. Patton's 10 days did not erase the deficiencies of the American army. They exposed them, confronted them, and began correcting them under combat conditions. The correction was uncomfortable. It involved removing Fredendall, replacing him with Patton, placing Bradley inside the new headquarters, assigning British liaison officers, replacing anti-tank weapons, adding personnel, retraining formations, and relieving Ward. It also involved humiliating soldiers with fines for sloppy uniforms, and forcing officers to confront the fact that their reputations would not protect them. The public version of the story often reduces this to Patton being Patton, loud, violent, demanding, obsessed with discipline. That misses the deeper issue. Patton understood that an army does not lose confidence all at once. Confidence decays through repeated small experiences. An order is ignored. A headquarters disappears. A tank attacks without infantry. A radio message arrives too late. A commander blames the weather. A soldier sees an officer avoid the danger that he is being ordered to face. The result is not immediate panic. It is hesitation. Hesitation becomes delay. Delay becomes isolation. Isolation becomes defeat. Patton tried to reverse the process in the same way. An order must be obeyed. A headquarters must be present. A tank and infantry formation must coordinate. A radio must carry the commander's intent. A commander must stand behind the order. The result might become confidence. Confidence becomes speed. Speed becomes initiative. Initiative becomes victory. This is why the uniform crackdown mattered to Patton, even when it appeared ridiculous. He wanted to interrupt the chain of decay at its smallest point. The soldier tying his necktie did not know he was participating in a psychological campaign. He only knew that the new commander was unreasonable. But that soldier also knew the new commander expected something from everyone. Patton did not present himself as a gentle reformer. He made discipline personal. He appeared without warning. He punished violations. He used insult and theatrical anger. He demanded that officers come forward. His approach was dangerous because it could produce resentment instead of loyalty. Yet resentment was not always a problem if it focused attention. The soldiers might hate the order and still remember it. They might mock the necktie and still wear it. They might complain about the helmet strap and still fasten it. When the artillery began, those habits created a sense that the army had boundaries and procedures. Procedures mattered because combat was chaos. Patton knew he could not eliminate fear. He could only prevent fear from becoming the command system. His deeper target was not the private who failed to salute. It was the officer who had stopped believing that standards mattered. That is why he judged commanders so severely. If a division commander hesitated, the hesitation spread. If a corps headquarters lost its grip, every subordinate formation felt the consequences. A commander could not ask soldiers to attack while communicating uncertainty. The officer had to appear convinced even when the situation was dangerous. This did not mean pretending that the enemy was weak. At El Guitar, Patton did not underestimate the German armored counterattack. He knew what 10th Panzer Division could do. He also knew that the American position had to hold. The difference between Kasserine and El Guitar was not that the Germans became less capable. The difference was that the Americans became more coherent. The mines did not defeat the German army by themselves. The artillery did not defeat it by itself. The tank destroyers did not defeat it by themselves. The system defeated the attack. Patton's method was therefore less about creating fearless men than about making fear manageable. A soldier did not need to believe he was immortal. He needed to believe that the man beside him understood the plan, that the artillery would respond, that the officers were present, and that retreat would not begin simply because someone at a distant headquarters had become confused. At Kasserine, soldiers had seen the chain of command break. At El Guitar, they saw it hold. The change was visible in the way formations move. During the earlier fighting, American units had often been committed in fragments, reacting to each German move. Under Patton, the Corps began to operate with clearer objectives and stronger coordination. The transformation did not make every decision correct. It made mistakes less likely to become disasters. That distinction is crucial. Armies do not win because they never make mistakes. They win because they recover before a mistake becomes irreversible. Patton's greatest contribution in those 10 days may have been his insistence that recovery had to be immediate. There would be no long period of self-pity after Kasserine, no extended investigation before action, no waiting for perfect reorganization. The army had to learn while preparing to fight. That urgency was forced upon him by the calendar. March 17 was approaching. The offensive could not wait for Second Corps to become ideal. Patton therefore simplified the mission as much as he could, pushed commanders toward clear action, and created a visible sense of movement. The offensive began with uncertainty. The enemy's withdrawal from Gafsa deprived Patton of the clean victory he wanted. Weather slowed the armor. Hill 322 became a stubborn obstacle. Orders changed. Yet each problem became another examination. Would the Corps continue when the enemy withdrew? Would it maintain direction when mud stopped vehicles? Would commanders coordinate when terrain broke their formations apart? Would soldiers hold when German armor returned? The answers came one at a time. At Gafsa, they advanced. In the mud, they adapted. At El Guitar, they held. At Sened, they coordinated movement and artillery. Against the 10th Panzer Division, they absorbed the attack and forced it back. No single event saved two corps. The army saved itself through a series of corrected behaviors, and Patton forced those corrections into existence before the Corps had time to become comfortable. The phrase, "fired his own officers," creates the image of Patton standing over a pile of dismissed commanders, clearing the army with a single sweep of anger. The reality was more complicated, and therefore more revealing. Fredendall was relieved by Eisenhower after confidence in his command had collapsed. Patton did not simply remove everyone associated with the previous leadership. He kept capable officers, used Bradley, accepted reinforcements, and relied on the divisions that had performed well. His most controversial relief came after he watched Ward's 1st Armored Division struggle to clear Hill 322. Patton believed the division needed a commander who would maintain pressure. Ward's supporters could argue that the attack had been difficult, that the orders were limited, and that caution was not cowardice. Both interpretations can exist at once. Patton's decision was not proof that Ward was a bad soldier. It was proof that Patton had defined the new Second Corps around a particular standard. The standard was initiative under pressure. The officer who did not meet it would lose command. That message was not subtle. It was meant to travel through every headquarters in Tunisia. A commander could not hide behind the phrase, "The situation was difficult." The situation was always difficult. The task was to act inside difficulty. The pressure reached the battalion and company levels as well. Patton demanded training and discipline, but he also visited soldiers and watched how orders were carried out. He wanted the army's energy to move from headquarters to the front. The front was where reality lived. A map could make a ridge look like a line. A soldier knew it was a slope exposed to machine gun fire. A staff officer could mark a road as open. A driver knew that rain had turned it into a trap. A commander could call a position weak. A rifleman knew whether the ground offered cover. Patton's inspections were valuable because they connected the command system to physical conditions. He did not trust reports alone. He wanted to see. That habit made him a more effective corps commander than he had been as a distant planner. He could identify where the attack had slowed, where communications failed, where the enemy had withdrawn, and where a subordinate commander had lost momentum. It also made him intrusive. He interfered. He pressured. He sometimes demanded actions that looked unreasonable. But a corps that had lost cohesion could not be repaired by remaining at a safe distance. Patton had to make the army feel watched. He had to make officers feel accountable. He had to make soldiers believe that the previous disorder was temporary and that the new standard was permanent. The psychological war was taking place inside the American command. The Germans were outside the wire, but the first enemy Patton fought was resignation. Resignation had a quiet voice. It said the army was inexperienced. It said the Germans were better. It said the terrain was impossible. It said the weather made movement impractical. It said the attack could wait. It said the commander at the front could not be expected to know everything. Patton's voice was louder. He answered every excuse with an order. The danger was that his anger could become its own form of blindness. He risked treating every pause as cowardice and every caution as failure. That is why Bradley mattered. The Corps needed Patton's urgency, but it also needed officers who could distinguish between an obstacle and an excuse. The battle around Hill 322 showed the cost of Patton's standard. The Americans did not simply sweep aside resistance. They attacked, stalled, attacked again, and finally failed to seize the high ground. Ward's relief did not turn Hill 322 into an American victory. Patton did not get everything he wanted. That fact is important because it prevents the story from becoming mythology. The 10 days did not produce a flawless commander or a flawless army. They produced something more realistic, a force that could fight effectively despite mistakes. The 1st Armored Division's struggle did not erase the success at El Guitar. The failed attack did not return 2nd Corps to the helplessness of Kasserine. The Corps could now absorb disappointment without losing its structure. That was the real test. Kasserine had not merely caused casualties, it had made every setback feel like the beginning of another collapse. Patton's reforms changed the emotional meaning of setbacks. A stalled attack became a problem to solve. A withdrawal became a decision to evaluate. A German counterattack became an event the artillery plan had anticipated. A difficult officer became a command question. The army no longer assumed that one failure had to become a general defeat. This is how an army grows up. Not by becoming fearless, but by learning that failure does not have to control the next decision. The battle at El Guitar became the proof. When German armor appeared before dawn, American units did not wait for the attack to explain itself. They acted on observation. Minefields disrupted the advance. Artillery struck. Tank destroyers engaged. Infantry held. The German force withdrew, prepared another attack, and tried again. The Americans stopped it again. Every repetition strengthened the psychological reversal. The first German tank destroyed might have been a surprise. The second might have been luck. By the time dozens had been hit, the American soldiers understood that the battlefield could be controlled. The German army still possessed skill, firepower, and experience, but its attacks could be read, disrupted, and defeated. The Americans had crossed a mental line. They were no longer simply surviving the German army. They were making the German army react. That was the beginning of operational confidence. When the North African campaign finally ended, the American army had paid heavily for its education. The losses in Tunisia could not be dismissed. Kasserine remained a painful memory. Officers had been removed. Divisions had been shaken. Soldiers had learned through danger rather than through exercises, but the lessons carried forward. The U.S. Army that landed in Sicily was not the same army that had struggled in Tunisia. It still made mistakes. It still suffered from rivalries, confusion, and imperfect decisions. Yet it had experienced the consequences of weak coordination and had seen the value of decisive leadership. Patton's later reputation would be shaped by Sicily, France, the breakout across Europe, and the famous armored drives that made him a legend. But the foundation of that reputation was forged in a much less glamorous setting. It was forged in dusty headquarters, muddy roads, frustrating hills, and a corps that had to be rebuilt while the enemy remained close. The 10 days after Kasserine revealed a version of Patton that was more important than the shouting caricature. He was not simply a man who loved attack. He understood that attack depended on discipline. He was not simply a commander who fired officers. He understood that personnel decisions communicated standards. He was not simply a performer who demanded neckties and helmet straps. He understood that rituals could restore identity after humiliation. He was not simply reckless. He knew that higher command had limited his mission, and that the Corps had to earn greater freedom through performance. Patton's anger had a purpose. His officers were not being removed because he needed victims. They were being judged because the army could no longer afford leadership that made soldiers pay for command confusion. The price of a bad order was not embarrassment in a headquarters. It was a platoon isolated on a ridge, a tank company trapped on a road, or an infantry regiment forced to retreat without knowing whether its neighbor was still holding. Kasserine had demonstrated that command failure moved downward. Patton wanted accountability to move downward as well. The Corps would no longer be a place where every failure disappeared into the complexity of war. Someone had to own the decision. Someone had to answer for the delay. Someone had to stand where the soldiers could see him. That was why Patton ordered Ward to lead the attack personally. That was why he appeared at headquarters and front lines. That was why he made the uniform matter. That was why he kept Bradley close. That was why he accepted the British liaison officers and the additional American personnel instead of treating assistance as an insult. He was assembling a command environment in which responsibility could not easily escape. His approach was severe, sometimes unfair, and often uncomfortable, but the army was operating under severe conditions. There was no time to wait for a perfect culture to develop. The culture had to be created under fire. The result was not a miracle. It was a forced acceleration. In 10 days, Patton compressed years of battlefield education into a series of demands. Be present, know the ground, communicate clearly, move with purpose, coordinate the arms, attack when ordered, hold when required, do not hide behind confusion, do not make soldiers pay for an officer's hesitation, and if a commander could not meet the standard, replace him before the next battle. The final judgment came not from Patton's speeches but from the enemy's behavior. At Kasserine, German commanders had exploited American confusion and advanced through the gaps. At El Guitar, German armor attacked a prepared American system and was stopped. That was the difference between an army that had been defeated and an army that had learned. Patton had not made the Americans into Germans. He had made them more American in the best military sense, larger, better supplied, increasingly coordinated, and capable of turning organization into force. The army did not need another Rommel. It needed officers who could make 90,000 men move as one body. The first step was removing the commanders who no longer possessed the trust of their troops. The second was challenging the officers who still possessed their positions but not Patton's confidence. The third was forcing every soldier to participate in the restoration of discipline. And the last was placing the entire corps in front of the enemy before anyone could ask whether the transformation was complete. On March 17th, Patton's offensive began. The enemy had already withdrawn from Gafsa. The weather turned the roads to mud. The hills resisted. Orders changed. A division commander was relieved. German armor attacked. American artillery responded. The corps moved forward. The result was not the sweeping victory Patton imagined when he first arrived. It was not a drive to the coast. It was not the destruction of every Axis formation in southern Tunisia. It was something more valuable. Second Corps remained intact. It maintained the initiative. It fought a major armored attack without disintegrating. It demonstrated that American soldiers could learn from defeat and return to battle with a different command structure. In war, that can be the difference between an army and a crowd. The story of Patton after Kasserine is therefore not really about uniforms or breakfast or one commander's temper. It is about the moment an army decided that failure would no longer be treated as destiny. Patton arrived at a headquarters still carrying the weight of defeat. He found officers uncertain, soldiers resentful, and higher commanders watching for evidence that the Americans could recover. He had 10 days before the offensive. He used those days to impose a standard so visible that nobody could pretend not to understand it. He demanded order because disorder had already cost lives. He demanded speed because hesitation had already surrendered ground. He relieved commanders because the next battle could not be fought according to the emotional habits of the last one. And when the German attack came at El Guitar, the army gave its answer. The mines held, the guns fired. The armor stalled, the infantry stood, the Germans withdrew. For the first time after Kasserine, American soldiers could look across the battlefield and understand that the enemy had been stopped not by accident, but by their own actions. That realization would travel farther than any order. It would follow the army from Tunisia to Sicily, from Sicily to France, and from France into the final campaigns of Europe. George S. Patton did not save the army by making every officer aggressive. He saved it by making command visible again. A headquarters had to know what was happening. An officer had to accept responsibility. A soldier had to believe that the formation around him would not vanish into confusion, and when one link failed, the army had to replace it before the next attack. That was the lesson of the 10 days. The army did not become unbeatable. It became recoverable. And sometimes, in war, recoverability is the first form of victory.